Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. In this half hour, we're going to talk about the impact of the youth vote on last Tuesday's elections, where young voters played a major role in big Democratic victories across our great nation. Our guest in this half hour is Eve Levenson, who is Senior Director of Political Strategy and Partnerships at Flytedesk. Flytedesk is the largest marketing platform for college students in the United States. Eve is also the board chair of Voters for Tomorrow and was director of the National Youth Vote at the Harris Waltz campaign last year. Eve, welcome to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. We're going to
Thank you
play
so
this.
much for having me.
You're welcome. We're going to play this clip from NBC News, Steve Kornacki talking about the impact of the youth vote in Zohran Mamdani's big victory in New York City last week.
It's obvious that he has been able to really garner the youth vote, right? He has really kind of brought a lot of young voters and new voters out to the polls. Is that being reflected in what you saw today?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so if the dividing line I've been using is 45 years of age, and we have that in the exit poll here. Voters under 45 years old, Mamdani won them by 44 points, okay?
Wow.
Voters over 45, Cuomo's going to win them by 12 points.
Wow.
So about a 56-point swing. And I'm just looking over here because this is the one I wanted to tell you. Under 30 years old, Mamdani wins them by 61 points.
Wow. That's huge.
So age was a huge factor in this.
Wow, that is huge.
That was Steve Kornacki, NBC News, talking about the youth vote in last week's election for New York City mayor. Our guest in this half hour from Flytedesk is Eve Levenson. Eve, first of all, welcome to Deadline DC for the first time. I hope it won't be the
Thank you.
last time. Sometimes I scare people, though, but anyway,
I
I
don't
hope
scare
it.
easily, don't worry.
Oh, good. Okay. Okay. Why were young people, why did young people vote in such vast numbers for Zohran Mamdani? I mean, if you look at the Kanaki numbers, they were really startling. Even I was startled, and I don't get startled easy after all these years in politics. Why did they turn out for him?
Definitely. I mean, I think that what the Mamdani campaign and Mamdani itself did very successfully was really focus on the issues that young voters care the most about. This is what we saw sort of consistently in the research that we at Flytedesk did both last year in our 2024 postmortem and the research we had done in October and September, is that the economy and especially affordability are really the top issues that are driving students and all young voters. And we saw that with the Mamdani campaign, he ran laser focused on that and presenting a possibility to young people about how to make their lives more affordable and better their lives. But I think we also saw, right, incredible youth numbers for the Democratic candidates across the board on Tuesday, including Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, Mickie Sherrill in New Jersey, and in support of Prop 50 in California.
Okay. Is affordability, we heard, God, I heard that word so often in New York City and Virginia and New Jersey. Is that the key buzzword for young voters?
I don't know so much that it's about that specific word. I think, right, when we talk to young voters and specifically at Flytedesk, we're usually talking to students specifically who we know are a really large portion because of their high propensity to vote compared to their non-college peers. What we know is that the economy is really the top issue for them. And when we dive into that about asking them really what is their concern there, I do think it really is sort of the cost of living. So I guess my takeaway wouldn't necessarily be that you need to necessarily use the specific word of affordability, but more so be focused on and be able to speak to both the reality of the struggle that so many young people are facing and being able to afford and live the lives they want to live, and being both able to understand and show that you understand what they're going through, but also present and make sure that that platform is communicated to those students and young voters about how you are going to make their lives more affordable, be able to make it so they can afford to live the lives they want to live.
My daughter is a big fan of Zohran Mamdani, and we talked about his election night, and I asked her why she thought he won, and her response was. He talked about what he wants to do for the city instead of just criticizing other politicians. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are lots of young voters and voters of all ages, right, that really want to see a sort of positive vision for what can happen. And I think that when we see that and when that's properly communicated to young voters in a way and in the places where they're getting their information, they're living their lives, that will continue to see positive impacts for the candidates that are able to successfully do that.
Okay, one of the questions I wanted to ask you, looking at the importance of the youth vote for Mandami, for Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, and Mickie Sherrill in New Jersey, what does the power of the youth vote in those elections mean in the Democratic Party? Let's start out with New York City. I think Kernacki said it. I don't know if it was in that clip, but he said, well, New York City isn't very representative of the nation. I guess not. That's what makes it the Big Apple. But what impact does the youth vote there and in other places have on the future of the Democratic Party? There's a lot of going back and forth within the party about, new leadership versus old leadership. What does the power of the youth vote mean for that debate?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that what we do, while obviously Tuesday's election was an off cycle election, we do have a really interesting, I think, sampling of different electorates across the board. When you look at New York City, you look at California, New Jersey, Virginia. We also had Supreme Court retention elections in Pennsylvania and local elections elsewhere. And while we don't have necessarily all the data on all those races right now, we, I think, sort of have the most on Virginia, New Jersey, NYC, followed by California. I do think, right, we see overall that when that the trends of voting that we're seeing with young people are a lot more typical, both in terms of turnout and also in terms of partisanship and vote share, to what we had been seeing before with Generation Z, sort of from the 2017 to 2022, 2023 era. And I think hopefully shows what I think a lot of folks, both in the youth vote space and those of us that had really been looking at that research, like what we put out with Flytedesk, that shows specifically sort of like how vote share did not drop that much amongst college students, that sort of we are seeing that come into reality as we're seeing young people continue to both turn out in higher numbers and also be voting for more consistently for Democratic candidates, especially when they're talking about the issues that we know young people care about.
In your opinion, do you think the Democratic Party needs to pay more attention to the youth vote, or was Tuesday's results a function of the fact that the party has started to pay attention and it's paying dividends?
I think it's a both and question. I think that there always needs to be more attention paid to young voters. I think that there is not, I don't know for I think that what we saw on Tuesday was a combination both of some really smart programs being run and some really intentional work being run, but also just the sort of visceral upsetness that young people are seeing and feeling as they're seeing Trump fail to follow through on the promises to make their lives cheaper, as they're seeing all these other things, these attacks on higher education on their campuses. But I think that no party or candidate should ever take anything for granted. And I think that going into the 2026 cycle, we know that it's going to be a much more crowded environment. There's going to be a lot more messaging programs that are coming from all sides, also trying to really encourage and continue to sort of like pull away at that support among young voters like we saw in 2024. And so it's important that we are also prepared to be firing ahead on all cylinders.
Now, in midterm elections, which we will have next year, young voters are notorious for not showing up in midterm elections when there's not a presidential race on the ballot. Are they going to show up next year? Is the turnout last week evidence that they will turn out in the midterm elections?
I think that we've seen really high youth voter turnout in the last two midterm elections. 2018 was an all-time high. 2022 was second only to 2018. And I think that whether or not young people show up at those high rates is going to be incumbent on whether or not we see the sorts of efforts and programs to be reaching young people, to be educating them, and to be turning them out.
Okay, we have to take a break now to for our radio listeners, but we will continue this interview online video with people who are watching us. Our guest is Eve Levenson, Senior Director of Political Strategy and Partnerships for Flytedesk, which is the largest marketing platform for college students in the United States. We'll be right back. Right after this message with more of Eve Levenson. So don't go anywhere. We'll still be here. We hope you will be too. Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour is Eve Levenson, who is the board chair of Voters for Tomorrow and the National Youth Vote Director for the Harris Walz presidential campaign. Eve, talk about what exactly is Flytedesk and talk about the survey of college students that Flytedesk did.
Yeah, definitely. So Flytedesk is the largest college marketing platform. As you mentioned, basically, we create the software that colleges use to manage ads on college campuses. We are on thousands of campuses across the country, a variety of channels. And then we work with, in addition to brands, candidates, campaigns, and causes to be able to get their message out there. We also do research as a part of that as well. And so actually, when I first joined Flytedesk, the first thing we did was put out really comprehensive, like 2024 retrospective, looking at the college vote specifically. And then we did additional research this fall, heading into the 2025 election cycle, to really get a sense of what students were thinking and feeling in the battleground states. Sort of overall, there's a lot of information there, but I would say some of the highlights really of what we found were that young people was that in 2024, we know that college students were about 39% of the 18 to 24 population and 48% of voters, which shows that college students are continuing to vote at a sort of higher rate than their non-college peers. We also know that turnout was down from 2020. So we saw that 77% of registered students in battleground states voted, which was down 6 percentage points from the same percent that voted in 2020. We saw a significantly smaller decrease when you looked at candidate choice. So we saw that in 2024, college students voted for Kamala Harris, 78% of them, which was down only 2 percentage points from the 80% of college students that voted for Biden in 2020. So that's sort of what we saw overall there. In terms of what issues are really driving students there, we saw that the top two issues across the board over time were really the economy and reproductive rights. When we ask students now in 2025 what their top issues are, the economy continues to be a top issue, but we see also that protecting democracy has really made it up there in sort of that number one or number two but issue priority there.
Okay, let me ask you this. Based on what you know about the attitudes of, college voters, do you think they differ very much at all from youth who aren't in college and are out, working? Are they less likely to vote for Democrats than their college counterparts?
I think that that has definitely been the case in some election cycles. I think there's not a ton of data that looks sort of at that non-college youth cohort on its own. But when we look at sort of the overall youth vote 18 to 29 in 2024 versus the college specific data, what we sort of can deduce from there is that if there was such a minimal drop off in support for Kamala Harris among the college youth, than to get to that sort of larger drop off that we saw among overall youth, that means that there had to have been a larger drop off in support among those non-college youth.
Okay. We're going to have to take another break to bring back our radio listeners. After we finish the break, we will continue this conversation with Eve Levenson, who is Senior Director of Political Strategy and Partnerships at Flytedesk. We're talking about the youth vote and its import, the role it played in the big Democratic victories last Tuesday. So we have more to talk about. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Welcome back to our radio listeners. We missed you, and we're glad you're back. This is Brad Bannon. I'm the host of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour is Eve Levenson, who is the board chair of Voters for Tomorrow and was the national youth director of the Harris Waltz presidential campaign. Eve, let's try this. One of the things I'm curious about, and there's some debate about this within the Democratic Party, how much of a role should the economy play in appeal to young voters as opposed to what we call the social issues, like abortion is the classic example. You seem to think that the economy is the big issue with young voters, but young voters are very much pro-choice. They're also pro-gay rights. So what's the balance there for successful Democrats?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it shouldn't be looked at as an either or scenario. What we saw in our polls of college students in 2024 and 2025 was that the economy is up there as the number one issue, but also abortion is as well, right? When we're looking at the top three issues, at least in our polls in October and September, the top three issues were economy, democracy, and abortion. So I think that speaking to folks and figuring out what is that right message there is really important. What we also saw in some message testing that we've done is that we know that student specific messages on the economy, on affordability, can really move voters and can really move student voters specifically, both in their likelihood to vote as well as how much they're going to be supporting a candidate. But likewise, we also saw great success last cycle with student specific messaging on birth control, among other issues. So I think that the reality is that students are looking for candidates that are going to be responding to their top concerns a lot of the time, which is the economy. But it doesn't mean it needs to be at the expense of or in place of other issues that we know young people do care a lot about.
Okay. Let me ask you this. Do young voters consider, there are issues about the age of the Democratic leadership. Do you have a feeling about whether youth voters, want younger Democratic candidates to represent them?
I think that there are definitely some that do. I think, though, what we saw on Tuesday, right, was young people coming out in large support for a variety of different candidates of different backgrounds. I will also say, I think we had a really interesting piece of data here from our fall research where we asked student respondents to be ranking the Democratic and Republican Party across basically a number of axes, and looking specifically, one of them that we asked about was like youthful versus old, and asking folks to sort of rate the two parties that way. And what we saw was that 52% of respondents thought that the Democratic Party was youthful, and only 16% of respondents thought that the Republican Party was youthful. So that doesn't get exactly necessarily to your question about what folks are looking for there, but I think that is definitely interesting. Some I think there's like an interesting tit point to add into, I know, all the conversations around that. I will say there definitely is a cohort of folks that are really powerfully asking for that new generational leadership, but I think it's hard to say sort of is that the number one issue that's going to be motivating young people.
Okay. How do you think the youth vote, and especially the big performance among young people last Tuesday, is going to change American politics? I remember, I'm old enough to remember when baby boomers like me were, everything to politics. Everybody was talking about, well, we got to reach baby boomers. Now we're passe, except to the viewers, my audience, hopefully. I'm not passe. But now we're kind of passe, and now we're talking about a new generation of voters leading the nation. What does that mean for American politics?
Definitely. I mean, I think that right, we've seen sort of the power of Gen Z and young voters in many cycles so far, right? The first cycle that many of us, including myself, were able to vote in was that 2018 cycle. And I think we saw coming out of 2018 a big focus on young voters. I think we also saw that there was a large focus then on trying to deliver on gun violence prevention legislation. I think we saw that large turnout in 2020 and 2022 as well. And I think we continue to see that this year in 2025. So I think that it will continue to be that one, obviously, the more young voters that become eligible to vote, the larger potential proportion of the electorate we are. And ideally, then the more sort of resources and attention that go to persuading and turning out, registering, and mobilizing young voters. But I also think, right, that there's a real opportunity for young voters to also be holding their elected officials accountable to what it is that they wanted them to be acting on. So I would like to think that one of the things that can come out of this election this week is an understanding that young voters are a key part of that winning coalition, especially for Democrats, and to understand sort of that the same attention that was going into them coming out of the 2018 and 2022 cycles, that the 2026 cycle can look like that as well as our next midterm.
Usually when there's a massive change in American politics, it is driven by new voters in the voter pool. And here we have young people participating in larger numbers. And, thinking out loud here, is it a coincidence that Democrats have been successful when they look forward? I mean, Donald Trump is always talking about make America great again. That's past tense. Democrats have had the new frontier. They've had the New Deal. Does looking forward as opposed to backward, is that a big deal to young voters?
I think so. I think though the way I'd frame it again, more so rather than sort of that looking forward versus looking backwards is there a positive vision that folks can vote for that they see will really respond to what they are going through right now. And I think that that's a commonality that you can see across the candidates that won on Tuesday. And I think really what young people are searching for and want to see going forward.
Okay. Okay. Any other final thoughts that we haven't covered about the youth vote and its importance? How do you
Yeah,
like to sum up?
I don't know if this summing it up so much, but I would say I think that another important component here is I know after the 2024 election cycle, there was a lot of talk around the sort of big shift to the right that we saw specifically among young men and that growing gender gap. And I think that what we saw both among students specifically in 2024 was that that gender gap wasn't necessarily as big as it was among non-college youth, but also what we saw in the early exit polls coming from Tuesday's election is that that gender gap really has shrunk. And what we saw is both that young women are supporting Democrats in even higher numbers than what we saw in 2022 and other years, but also that those young men are really sort of coming back to the Democratic Party. And so I think that what I would say there, right, is that young voters are wanting to be engaged. They're really eager and they're clearly following and reacting to what's happening in politics, and that they need to continue to be invested in. We need to be speaking to them, and we need to be speaking to them not only as turnout audiences but also as a persuasion audience, where we're making sure that they know that our candidates understand what is at stake and understand and are presenting a way to make their lives better.
Okay. Thank you very much, Eve, for joining us today. I hope you can come back and visit us and our audience again. I want to thank our guest, Eve Levenson, Senior Director for Political Strategy and Participation at Flydesk, Flytedesk, which is the largest marketing platform for college students in the United States. I also want to thank our first guest, Alex Lawson, who is Executive Director of Social Security Works, who discussed the maneuvering behind the opening of government shutdown. And of course, I want to thank our intrepid executive producer, Mark Grimaldi, for making this all possible and covering up my mistakes. We'll be back next week with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon, and we hope you're back too, because we'd miss you if you weren't.